The date is 15th November 1917, and on a rain-soaked stretch of trench near Cambrai, a German lieutenant peers through the pre-dawn murk at what appears to be a standard British Lewis gun emplacement. He signals his men forward. They've rehearsed this assault dozens of times, suppressed the gun position, advance under covering fire, overwhelm the crew. Standard trench warfare tactics, proven effective for 3 years of grinding attrition. But as his stormtroopers begin their rush, something impossibly wrong happens. The Lewis gun doesn't fire at them. It fires past them, sideways. The bullets aren't coming from where the gun is pointing. They're coming from an angle that makes no geometric sense, chewing through his advancing troops from a direction his mind refuses to accept. Men fall, screaming in confusion as much as pain. The lieutenant drops flat, trying to understand what his eyes are telling him. The gun barrel is pointed 45 degrees away from his position, yet his soldiers are being cut down with methodical precision. It violates every principle of ballistics he's ever learned. Within minutes, the assault collapses into chaos. Men retreat not because they're outgunned, but because they cannot comprehend where the fire is originating. They cannot suppress what they cannot locate. They cannot return fire at a target that isn't where the weapon appears to be. This is their first encounter with one of the strangest firearms modifications ever deployed in combat. The Vivian-Bessières offset gun mounting system, a device so counterintuitive that is turned basic geometry into a psychological weapon. By late 1917, trench warfare had calcified into a nightmare of predictable patterns. Machine gun positions were the anchors of defensive lines, and both sides had become devastatingly efficient at identifying and neutralizing them. The problem was fundamental. A gun crew had to expose themselves to aim at the enemy, and the moment they opened fire, their position was instantly revealed. Artillery observers would mark the muzzle flash. Snipers would target the gunner. Enemy machine guns would suppress the position. A Lewis gun might fire for 30 seconds before incoming fire made the position untenable. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A gun emplacement that revealed itself survived on average less than 2 minutes under concentrated return fire. Casualty rates among machine gun crews exceeded 70% in sustained engagements. Men volunteered for these positions knowing they were accepting near certain death or maiming. The British had tried various solutions. Indirect fire positions helped, but reduced accuracy dramatically. Remote firing mechanisms proved too unreliable in the mud and chaos of trench warfare. Moving gun positions after each burst worked in theory, but proved impossible in practice. A Lewis gun with its mounting, ammunition, and cooling equipment weighed over 30 kilograms. Far too much to reposition quickly in a trench barely wide enough for a man to stand. What was needed seemed paradoxical. A way for a gunner to aim and fire at the enemy whilst remaining completely concealed behind cover, with the gun itself positioned somewhere else entirely. The challenge appeared unsolvable. A gun must point at its target. A gunner must see the target to aim. These were axioms of warfare since the invention of gunpowder. No amount of clever engineering could change basic physics, or so conventional wisdom insisted. Captain Frederick Vivian and Lieutenant William-Bessières, working at the British experimental station at Hythe in Kent, approached the problem from an entirely unexpected direction. Rather than trying to protect the gunner whilst keeping the gun and gunner together, they asked a different question. What if the gun and the gunner didn't need to be in the same place at all? Their solution, finalized in October 1917, was mechanically simple but conceptually radical. The Lewis gun, a weapon normally mounted on a post allowing 360 degrees of rotation, was instead mounted on an angled bracket that offset the barrel approximately 60 centimetres to one side. The gun could still traverse and elevate, but its barrel was now positioned well away from the gunner's location. The gunner remained behind a reinforced section of trench wall, peering through a specially designed periscope sight. This optical device, borrowed from submarine technology, used two mirrors angled at 45 degrees to provide a view of the battlefield, whilst the observer remained completely hidden. The sight was calibrated to account for the offset, showing the gunner exactly where the rounds would impact despite the barrel being several feet to the side. The mounting itself was manufactured from hardened steel at the Royal Small Arms factory at Enfield, with production beginning in November 1917. Each assembly weighed approximately 14 kilograms, significantly lighter than conventional mounting systems because it required no protective shield. The gunner wasn't behind the gun, so no shield was necessary. The offset distance varied slightly depending on local fabrication, but the standard specification called for 61 centimetres, roughly the width of two men standing shoulder to shoulder. When installed, the arrangement looked utterly bizarre. The Lewis gun protruded from what appeared to be an empty section of trench, aimed at nothing in particular, while several feet away, a soldier crouched behind solid cover, manipulating controls that seemed disconnected from the weapon itself. The mechanical linkage consisted of a rigid rod system that transmitted the gunner's traverse and elevation inputs to the offset mounting. Production records remain partially classified, but historical analysis suggests approximately 300 units were manufactured between November 1917 and March 1918. The majority were deployed to sectors where trench warfare remained static and predicted to continue, the very areas where machine gun crews suffered the highest casualties. The first documented use came during the Battle of Cambrai. Captain James Thornton of the 15th Lancashire Fusiliers recorded the deployment of two offset Lewis gun positions in his sector. German forces, probing for weaknesses in the British line, advanced expecting to suppress the Lewis gun positions they'd identified through aerial reconnaissance. Instead, they encountered fire from angles that made no tactical sense. Thornton's account, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, describes German soldiers going to ground and returning fire at empty sections of trench, whilst the actual gun positions remained untouched. The psychological effect proved more devastating than the physical casualties. German units reported encountering geistgewehre, ghost guns, that fired from impossible locations. Infantry assaults faltered not because of overwhelming firepower, but because soldiers couldn't identify what they needed to attack. The fundamental calculus of infantry assault, locate the gun, suppress the gun, advance, had been broken. Further north, near Passchendaele, records from the 8th Division mention offset mountings used to cover approach routes across no man's land. The effect was particularly pronounced in night actions. A raiding party advancing on what aerial photographs showed as a Lewis gun position would find it empty, only to be caught in enfilade fire from a source they hadn't anticipated. Accounts from captured German soldiers, interrogated at the divisional intelligence level, repeatedly mention confusion and the phrase, "the guns that fire sideways." Some refused to believe the explanation, insisting it was impossible for a gun to fire in a direction it wasn't pointing. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans, facing this unexpected tactical problem, attempted their own solutions. Intelligence reports from early 1918 mention captured documents describing a similar concept under development at the Spandau arsenal. The German version, designated the Winkelrohr Lafette, used a more complex system of geared transmission to offset an MG-08/15 machine gun. However, the German design proved significantly heavier, approximately 23 kilograms compared to the British 14, and required more substantial installation. More critically, German production capacity was increasingly strained by 1918, and the system never entered widespread deployment. only an estimated 30 to 40 units were manufactured. The Americans, arriving in force during 1918, showed interest in the British offset system, but ultimately declined to adopt it. American tactical doctrine emphasized mobility and aggressive assault rather than static defense, and the offset mounting system offered little advantage in offensive operations. It was a weapon designed for the unique hell of trench warfare, and by the time American units were arriving in significant numbers, the nature of the fighting was beginning to shift towards more fluid operations. The French developed a parallel system, the affût décalé, for the Chauchat automatic rifle. French military records suggest approximately 150 installations, primarily in the Verdun sector. However, the Chauchat's notorious unreliability made the system less effective. A gun that frequently jammed was no less vulnerable, whether offset or not. What distinguished the British system was its simplicity and reliability. The Lewis gun was already proven as one of the war's most dependable automatic weapons. The offset mounting added minimal mechanical complexity. There were no complex gears to jam with mud, no fragile optical systems beyond the simple periscope sight. A trained crew could install the system in under an hour and maintain it with basic tools. The actual military impact of the Vivian-Bessières offset system remains difficult to quantify with precision. It was deployed late in the war, in limited numbers, and to specific sectors where its advantages were most pronounced. No comprehensive after-action study was conducted before the armistice. However, certain indicators suggest significant tactical value. Units equipped with offset mountings reported markedly lower casualty rates among machine gun crews. Some accounts suggest reductions of 50% or more, though these figures should be treated cautiously, given the fragmentary nature of the records. More reliably documented is the psychological effect on German forces. Intelligence summaries from early 1918 repeatedly mention German tactical adjustments in sectors where offset guns had been identified. Attack patterns changed. Assaults became more cautious, with longer preparation phases and more extensive artillery support, all of which slowed the tempo of operations and consumed resources. The device's influence extended beyond the immediate tactical. Post-war weapons development showed renewed interest in remote weapon systems and offset mounting solutions. The concept of separating the gunner from the gun would reappear in various forms: remote machine gun turrets on aircraft, remotely operated weapon stations on modern armored vehicles, and eventually the widespread use of cameras and remotely controlled systems in contemporary military equipment. Today, surviving examples of the Vivian-Bessières offset mounting system are extraordinarily rare. One verified example is held by the Imperial War Museum in London, though it is not currently on public display. Another reportedly exists in the collection of the Royal Armouries, though cataloguing records list it ambiguously. The device was never officially designated as a separate weapon system. It appeared in logistics records simply as mounting, Lewis gun, pattern 1917, modified, which has made historical tracking difficult. Photographs are similarly scarce, as the system was used primarily in forward positions where photography was dangerous and restricted. The rain continues to fall on that stretch of trench near Cambrai, and the German lieutenant lies in the mud, trying to make his men understand something that defies their training. The gun is over there, he insists, pointing to where the barrel protrudes, but the bullets come from here. His stormtroopers stare at him with the particular exhaustion of men asked to assault a position that violates basic logic. They've been trained to suppress machine guns, to coordinate fire and movement, to use the terrain. None of that training accounts for a gun that fires sideways. Within the hour, they withdraw. Not routed, not defeated by superior firepower, simply unable to formulate a tactical response to a weapon that shouldn't work the way it does. This is what 2 British officers achieved with 14 kilograms of steel, 2 mirrors, and a willingness to question an assumption so fundamental that no one had thought to challenge it. They created a weapon that killed as much through confusion as through ballistics, that turned geometry itself into an instrument of war. The Lewis gun that fired sideways, that impossible contradiction of every soldier's understanding of how firearms operated, that strange angular mounting that made German infantry assault doctrine suddenly obsolete in those sectors where it appeared. 300 units, perhaps fewer, deployed for less than a year before the armistice rendered trench warfare obsolete. But for those months, in those trenches, it represented something profound. Proof that the deadliest innovations are often those that make the enemy question what they know to be true. The gun pointed one direction and fired another, and that simple impossibility was enough to turn advancing stormtroopers into confused, retreating men who no longer trusted their own eyes.